Yes, please. Okay, I need to actually change the view to speaker. There we go. I always forget to do that. Hello, and welcome to our September 2021 Jupyter community call. Woo! I love autumn. I'm super happy to be here. I hope you all are enjoying whatever season it is where you are. I'm Isabella. I'll be your host today. And yeah, welcome. If you haven't been here before, you don't know, Jupyter community calls are a place that we gather across Jupyter projects and sometimes outside to celebrate what people are doing in the community, show off resources that have helped one another, just generally kind of get excited. Remember, you know, why we're all working hard on this project and learn from each other in the process. There are a few things I do have to point out before we start. One, this call is recorded. Two, this is a Jupyter community event, so we are held to the Jupyter Code of Conduct, right? And that includes me. You can find this at any time, jupyter.org/conduct. And I think it also is linked at the top of the agenda. I haven't seen the number of participants go up, so I won't link the agenda again yet. How we're gonna run this is we're basically following that document. So the first thing we're gonna do today is talk about the quick reports, but we're just going to go in order of the agenda. People have signed up ahead of time, hopefully. I think we still have a little bit of room though. So if you are so inspired by the absolutely amazing work that I'm sure we're going to see today, we may still have a little time. I will keep you updated on that though. But yeah, I'll be moving us along. I don't see anything in the short reports right now, but I will give you a few moments of silence to consider if that's true. Nothing exciting has happened? I don't believe that.
You painted your wall.
I did paint my wall, and it's going to be recorded, and everyone will see that I painted my wall in the last month. Yes.
Yeah, I had to remove my gray screen filter just to be like, oh, are things still weird? But yeah, that's a shout out. So shout out to you for painting your wall and the satisfying feeling of pulling away the painter's tape. As like, isn't it like I just want a wall where I can put painter's tape on and peel it off.
That's sort of like the. Sorry, carry on, Isabella.
Oh, I was just going to say, is it satisfying without having painted around it? But go ahead.
That image that you just painted is sort of the grown-up version of, did anyone else play with Microsoft Paint and you'd like scribble with the select tool and you'd press the delete key?
Yes, that's really true.
I'm sure that's what you were going for.
It took me 3 years to paint this wall. So yes, that's the case. I keep doing everything but that. So
congratulations.
Well, that's because Isabella had to go and find the pigments for yellow. You know, she had to travel the world like old painters did.
No,
that's why.
I just said you want to have real Jupyter reports. Sorry. Okay. Well, thank you all for that entertaining note on my freshly striped wall. We're going to go into the agenda items, and I am super excited. We have Angus first on the list. Are you ready to present?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Take it away.
Okay, cool. Right. Okay, can everyone see my screen? That's a silly question, isn't it? But
I can see. Okay. No, it's not. Jupyter Lab.
Yay, okay, good. So I haven't got too much of a structured talk today, which is quite freeing. So hi, I'm Angus. I've worked on a few different Jupyter Lab extensions, but the one that's been sort of the most popular, I think, has been Jupyter Lab Markup. And Nick, who's here today, did a lot of work recently in making that extensible so that other people can kind of hook into it. And the general sort of premise there initially was just that I wanted to add a little bit more sort of interesting markup to Markdown than just bold text, images, and so on. So it started off with diagrams, and then from there, there's been sort of a few other extensions that have been added, I think. But there is actually a deeper kind of question embedded in the idea of Jupyter Lab Markup, which is like, what else can we do with Markdown rendering? How else can the notebook itself be a bit more interesting? And I think I hadn't really grasped that until recently, and I think Nick had been sort of commenting on the GitHub issues, and I came to appreciate there's actually there's a whole way to go there with what else we could be doing, and it does raise some interesting questions. But related to Jupyter Lab Markup is this extension that we've been prototyping based on the discourse for rich sort of Markdown rendering with kernel outputs. And so JupyterLab iMarkdown is an extension that sort of integrates with JupyterLab iMarkup, and its purpose is to kind of realize one particular implementation of this concept. So I've got the discourse open here just to kind of goes all the way back to August, which I guess isn't that long. But the idea was, could we embed things, sort of variable declarations in our Markdown and have them render? And so this extension—
It started raining a little when I got outside before I almost turned around and came back for an umbrella.
Jeffrey, you aren't muted.
Stay dry, man.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, oh yes, that's definitely a problem. Yes, this extension has it's been realized in a particular version, and this is not really supposed to be something that will end up in JupyterLab core. It's more of just an idea of what this could look like. So I've got a couple of notebooks here that make this maybe a bit more apparent. So here's a nice mermaid diagram, which is quite cool. And I'll restart the kernel and switch.
Hey, don't look over show the syntax for that, please.
Oh yeah, of course. So yeah, this is a Markdown, a mermaid diagram, and the plugin that implements this has chosen to use a code block and repurpose it with the mermaid syntax to actually render it as a diagram. And there's also another syntax for SVG Bob, if anyone's seen that, which is like ASCII diagrams, but they're sort of more self-explanatory. So anyway, this is just the idea, the premise here. And so I can run this IPython kernel, and if I create an HTML rich object, which has some basic styling, setting some text to green. This here is a markdown cell that's sort of been hacked a little bit, don't tell anyone, to enable this rich rendering. And using these curly brace syntax, which is an arbitrary choice of tokens, but we've chosen these curly braces for this example, and we can now embed these kernel outputs here. So this gets a little bit more interesting when you do things with, for example, sliders, so or widgets. So I've created a little slider widget here, and then if I actually run the markdown cell, which again is just the same syntax referring to the slider variable, it will actually render the slider. Now, if I'd been really clever and thought about this beforehand, I would have also installed the Zeus kernel and looked at the X widgets to sort of demonstrate that with a different kernel. But I'm not that clever, so I forgot to. But take it as read that this is not supposed to be kernel specific. So all of the kernels should implement a particular part of the protocol which enables us to say what do the results of these expressions look like. It's not a mandatory part of the specification. So some kernels might not do this, but it's possible for all kernels to do so. And so lastly, here's a little matrix in a list rather than an NumPy array. And again, you can sort of see that it's embedded the text here. Now the formatting actually is a little bit off here. I've changed it a lot recently, so maybe I forgot to change it back. And some of the trickier parts is sort of working out the appropriate styling. But you can see the general premise here. This is what we're trying to achieve. And one last example is, if I can remember the shortcut, there we go. Here's SymPy, which if anyone hasn't used it, is sort of symbolic expression, so you can work with maths. And here's the result of an expression embedded in some markdown here. So this is the actual markdown, and then this is the result, which takes a little while to load. So yeah, this is the basic tool, and I haven't really got a lot more to say on what it does. This is sort of, you've seen everything there is to see, but it does for me raise some interesting questions about what else could we do here. So there are some questions around, should this be a new cell type? Should we have a markdown cell and then an X markdown or an I markdown cell, so that we have backwards compatibility, and so that we maintain a distinction between a cell that executes code, which is what these markdown cells now do, and cells which don't, which was the old markdown cell. And there's also other questions about, to me at least, like what's the next evolution? Do we just add a new markdown cell, or do we think, could we go even further and rethink other parts of the notebook? Because these are all sort of different interpretations of rich markup. They're rich objects, where we could do the same thing potentially with diagrams or with GeoJSON or something. I think there's a lot of opportunities here. So that's sort of it from my side. So I don't know what the protocol is now. Should I stop sharing and go from there, or?
That's up to you. It's open for discussion if you still want to share. That's
okay. No, I'm happy to leave it on.
Yeah, that was that was a great description to me. Do people have other thoughts? I have a feeling people do.
I have a question. First, this is fantastic. Let me just start with that. So the question so getting back to your question of whether or not there should be a new kind of markdown cell or a new kind of cell, or whether they should just fit into the old markdown cells. One question that I have is just standard markdown completely within the scope of this thing? So is this a pure extension to markdown, or does it change some differences?
Yeah,
so
it's a good question actually, because part of the questions I alluded to at the start is that markdown itself isn't sort of one thing. Sort of does now a common mark variant a lot of people agree on is sort of what markdown represents, but you don't have to use that. And when this syntax here that we've got that enables these curly braces to inject markdown, to inject kernel outputs, that technically isn't part of the common mark specification. So we've now got a common mark plus going on here, which is in theory a superset of markdown. So it's everything you would normally do and a little bit extra, but it's not out of the question that people could introduce stuff that breaks things. So you can put normal markdown in here and it will just work normally. So if I were to do that in the cell below, I could say, this is bold text. Does that? I was trying to remember whether there's actually keyboard shortcuts, but there aren't. Okay, this is bold text. So yeah, this is it's all normal markdown, but you can also use these curly braces to actually execute code. And the way that this particular extension works is it scans the markdown for these tokens. If it finds them, it will ask the kernel to give it some extra information so that it can then inject the results into the markdown that's rendered. Does that answer your question, Rick?
It does, thank you.
Cool, great.
Will this work with a magic function that goes on the top of the cell? So that I take a regular cell, put this magic function so that it becomes like iMarkdown, and then with all the syntax highlighting and the variables. That's
a good question. So we were talking about, the people on the discourse thread were talking about one of the ways you could do this. And a different way would be to use magic. So the answer to your question is, if you use a markdown display object and you present that to Jupyter Lab. So for example, if you use IPython, for example, if you were to create a markdown object from ipython.display, that gets rendered by the front end, in this case, Jupyter Lab, as a markdown object. But we don't expect those things to embed code that can be executed. So this is all done at the notebook level rather than so it's done by the code that's running the cell. So if you don't have markdown in a markdown cell, it's a normal markdown. But if it's in a markdown cell, then it does this extra feature that enables us to sort of do stuff with the outputs. It actually wouldn't be impossible to modify the markdown renderer. And so instead of doing this on the cell, we could say anytime we see any markdown that needs to be rendered, we could ask a kernel for cell outputs. But then when we start to do that, we get into sort of some tricky questions. Like if we had no kernel and we were just rendering markdown somewhere else in Jupyter Lab, what would we do? So the short answer is magic won't work to give you any of this extra functionality, but it'll still render it as normal markdown.
And so I was actually prototyping this a little bit yesterday, and the magic can work if it embeds both the plain markdown and the markdown, like with the curly brackets, and also saves into the notebook file the output items which are going to be rendered inline, which is possible. I don't think that these are the two approaches. It can be one or the other. I do think it'd be sort of nifty to have an iMarkdown output MIME type. But
yeah, and if I could speak to that, I have a habit to talk. So if anyone else wants to interrupt, I don't know whether it's just my Zoom. I can't actually easily change the view, so I'm just sort of looking at like 4 people. So interrupt me if I need to stop. But yeah, that's it. There's loads of different ways we could do this, and I think we were actually just sort of talking on the discourse just before the meeting. But the kind of, it would be quite exciting if you could kind of move away from it has to be a code cell or a markdown cell, or it has to be a cell output. There are lots of different ways we could have rich markup in a Jupyter notebook. And currently the only way we can do that is cell outputs, or if you have one of the three cell types. So yeah, there's so many different ways we could do this, and it would be quite nice to imagine a world where, like, I have this idea in my head where the notebook is rather than having cell types, it's just a load of MIME types, and then the front end knows how to either render it or edit it. We get into other problems if we start doing things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of scope here to do this. And to be really clear, this is an extension that I've worked on to kind of deliver a prototype, but this could be binned tomorrow and something else could be put in its place if we decided this was going to be something that should be in Jupyter Lab itself. Yeah.
So yeah. Oh, do we just want? Should we just yell at them together, Nick, or how do you want to do this?
I just wanted to toss out one idea. So one thing that I had thrown out and then I didn't pick it back up because it's been busy. One thing that every Markdown representation does have to agree on are links. And so links and images are strongly represented across every flavor because you can't break those.
Yeah.
And they bring with them a lot of nice features of hypermedia. So, you know, if instead of curly braces, we had the 8 different forms of image references, right? Images and links, they give you the handy feature of when they break, you still can find out something about them. They have alt texts, they have titles, things like that. And that's the thing that I most worry about is as we get fancier and fancier markup, the next client won't be able to render it. And now it looks like absolute, manure, right? Like these are the things that I really dislike is I get this cool notebook from a couple of years ago and it worked with some specific way that someone had manipulated their jQuery notebook environment and then it doesn't render anymore. So that would be another syntax that wouldn't require too much special casing of the token stuff. And I defer.
Which is great. I love all these things. I've built something similar to this in a pure Python kernel. And I would not do away with inputs and outputs and just go straight to reppers. But rather my approach has been to say I have a markdown cell with some templates in it. I'm going to show that output. And then the outcome of my document is going to be all the outputs put together. So I've gotten to a place where I haven't really been separating the inputs and the outputs because to Nick's point, in a few years when I get to this thing, we're not looking at it at the cell level anymore and we're looking at it at the document level. So, this is great stuff, Angus. But as you move forward, there's this really fun high velocity stuff that happens at the cell level. But remember to question that stuff against like the enduring document. So like, I like the Jinja-like syntax because I'm like, hey, I can use that everywhere. But, you can do a lot with this stuff. I look forward to seeing where it goes. But the question that I'm curious about is like, in the document that you're running now, are you effectively using 2 different kernels? And does that change? Like, is there a JavaScript kernel effectively and a Python kernel? In theory, I'm wondering if the kernel's your abstraction here, because I don't know what it means to have a document with multiple kernels. The only person I've seen really do that well is Fernando.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. There's 2 questions here. There's one about link syntax, ideas, and the other one is, about this multiple kernel. I'll answer Nick's first, which is, I definitely agree. At the moment, if you try and render this in Jupyter Notebook, for example, where we don't have a front-end renderer, it will look terrible. I actually haven't tried it. So in some cases, terrible might be okay, but it would be useful to have a fallback. And I think in an ideal world, the fallback would be we'd have multiple different display types in the MIME bundle, and we would fall back on something that had made it clearer that this wasn't rendering properly. Because although we could do stuff with links, I think as well, for all of the other kinds of Markdown extensions we can do, besides this particular one, we still will have the question of how do we make this work on other clients? How do we tell other clients we've got some special markup here? And I think it's a really big question. And that was I don't know if Nick was here when I was talking about this, but yes, that's what I was alluding to earlier. There are some big questions here where Markdown isn't actually this very highly specified thing for a lot of clients. We need to maybe work on specifying it more carefully in the notebook itself. At the moment, the notebook specification, I think, is marked.js. But it's not actually written down in an RFC or anything. I think it's maybe written as a comment in one of the wiki pages, if I remember correctly, which is why we have Mistune doing the NB convert stuff. I actually do like the idea of the link syntax from just an ergonomics perspective, because adding an alt text is quite useful, and we can sort of move on in the same way we have attachments in notebooks. Use this attachments resolver in JupyterLab. We could have a similar kind of protocol for this kind of stuff for the kernel. So that's the first thing with links. I definitely agree. We can't just sort of move forward with this as like as a blessed extension or anything, because those are the big problems. And I think we do want to support this. And yes, JupyterLab is one of the front ends, but there's loads of different ways people use Jupyter, including MB-convert and all that stuff. The second point is about the kernel. So yeah, I mean, in absolute terms, there's only one kernel here. It's the IPy kernel. But I definitely agree that you can think about this in like what's, in a high level sense, what's going on here. And yeah, we are obviously doing stuff, some kind of magic at the front end. The front end is not a dumb, just rendering what we see in the markdown. We're also kind of weaving things in, and that's sort of maybe a bit cleverer than we used to have things happening in Jupyter. But I think at the moment, this is a reasonable level of spooky magic. And I think the difficulty is in making sure that any front end can render this, and that's about standardizing, which is what I'm sort of interested in us maybe having conversations around. Like, how's this going to look if we try to make this a part of JupyterLab or Jupyter, sorry, as a whole? And in particular, when you were talking about documents, because Tony, have you been working on is it the Deathbeds project?
Yeah, that's Nick and I.
Yes, I knew Nick well, and I was okay. So that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about how you could like Notebook 2.0, a bit tongue in cheek, what could you do with the notebook next? If you could start again today, how do we design it? Sorry,
I'll just start with Prosemir, right? I mean, like, in a sense, a notebook, you want it to just act like document first, right? Yeah. And the cells and all that other stuff. We have to do that because the UI is hard. It's very hard to make a computational document that feels the way that you want it. But anyhow, you weren't actually asking, so.
No, well, no. I think this is a community call, isn't it? We all put our thoughts in. Yeah, I mean, I think Prosemir would actually be really useful for the Markdown, let alone everything else. My rhetorical question was going to be, I wonder whether, in my head, the notebook is just a collection of objects. And I've used the Jupyter Flex for Voila extension, which it basically takes the notebook and restructures it into the sort of front end, which it doesn't have the notebook structure anymore. It's sort of all over the place. And that's one front end, but there's loads of different ways that people use notebooks. And so obviously the more general we get, the less we can specify in the notebook itself. We can't say a notebook is a top-down document anymore. And you can even go further. And so I think that's what I think is the bare minimum abstraction for a notebook is it's a collection of things which have important semantic meaning that the front end should be able to understand, at least a subset of. So front ends currently understand Markdown and code, but could we generalize that even further and say they can understand anything as long as it has a MIME type? That's sort of where my thoughts have been going at the moment.
I'm going to hop in really quick and say that my sort of desire is that notebooks can actually be a distribution format. And for that, you want to be able to send notebooks to people without having to have a list of, here are the extensions that you need to view this notebook or instructions on how to use it. And that requires a more concrete specification for how the notebook is displayed.
So
I'm
there's
sorry
a couple
to cut this off, but I love when there's really awesome discussion. So I always feel really bad about this, but I do want to make sure we get to other things. So
there's more time at the end.
Okay. Well, no, I was like, if you want to finish your thought, Tony, that's fine. I was just trying to make sure.
I'll apologize for talking so much. Carry on, Tony.
No, don't.
It's all right. Like at the end of the day, all of us are being repetitive and redundant because Donald Knuth wrote about literate programming a long time ago. I really think that in some way or another, we're just delving back into old research and there's some good foundations to build off of. So I hope we can bring the old and the new together and design something radical again.
Also, no apologies needed. This is what it's for. I love watching discussion like this happen. So this is wonderful. And thank you for such a great demo. I appreciate it too. It's very clear to me what was going on, which is not always the case. So thank you from me as well. Wonderful, wonderful. After that, quite an act to follow up on. But Roland, are you ready to share?
Yeah, I am. I'm going to share my screen here. And I don't think this will take up all the rest of the time. I know that there are some other demos coming that will be more exciting probably than talking about security stuff. But what I wanted to do, wait, can you still see?
I can see HackMD, the
You
the
can.
agenda.
Okay, that's weird because it says my screen sharing is paused, but that's weird. Well, I don't want to quite do it this way, I guess. But anyway, if people can
specific tab rather than your window, and that's why it says sharing is paused, because you've moved away.
I shouldn't have moved anything. Don't mess with things when you're doing stuff, I guess. How's that?
I see a Google Doc.
That's great. All right, that's all right. So what I wanted to share with everybody was that we have this engagement with Trusted CI, which is the National Science Foundation Center of Excellence for Cybersecurity. And that runs through the end of the year. And so Rick Wagner and I, Rick at UCSD, we've been working a little bit on the Jupyter security subproject in collaboration with Trusted CI. And one of the first things that they've done for us is actually try to do a full census of all of the security related documentation from across the project. And Kay Avila did this. And as you can see, it's about 7 pages worth of links. And in among these links are some comments about how clear the documentation is and whether or not things are being repeated across different subprojects, or whether or not actually the documentation says one thing in one place but says something else in another. Trusted CI is going to work on this census and try to put together kind of a high-level document about Jupyter security best practices, and then share it with the community as they've shared this document here. This is a public document, by the way.
This girl who I saw.
Jeffrey, you're not muted if you think you are.
One I saw, met with on
Jeffrey. Jeffrey.
Don't. Okay. Well,
I'm just talking over him just for his safety. I'm sorry.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. So back on track. This document's public, so anybody can see it, and everybody's welcome to place comments on it, of course. So I've left that link there. There's also a link to it from the discourse that Rick very kindly put up. So we're going to be discussing this document at the Jupyter Security Subproject meetings, which are bi-weekly on Fridays. You can find the invitation to the bi-weekly security meeting here in the document as part of the calendar. And everybody's welcome to join and talk to us about Jupyter and security stuff. That's it.
Fantastic. I love seeing these updates personally.
Have y'all been building a security team, or is it still the Rick and Roland show? We need to get more folks.
There's a security team already, but the Rick and Roland show, as you call it, yeah, we're the hosts. So I guess that's awesome. Kind of how it works.
I'm here for that. Thank you.
Great.
Roland, I did have a bit of a question about the security meetup. Like, is there a kind of a reporting process or anything like that? I don't know if people saw a few weeks ago on Twitter, there was like some notices of Travis not being super cool, and that was kind of a thing that I wanted to like flag to someone at Jupyter who could then like get a message out to all of the various repositories in case they were still on Travis. I'm just like wondering if there's a process for that.
So yeah, this is part of why we've started a Jupyter security subproject, because it is actually, frankly, figuring out how to share that kind of conversation with people, or get the word out about things isn't entirely clear. And so we're trying to figure out how to make that process of where do you go when you want to share something, or when you need to go get help, how do we make that more transparent? For vulnerability reporting, we want to make it clear to everybody that there is basically one place to be doing that, and that is security@ipython.org, and that's on every bi-weekly agenda, and it's also on the new Jupyter.org security page, which is at jupyter.org/security, which we didn't have until a couple weeks ago when Rick put that together. So we have a high level page for that. Yeah, there's every so often there are these nice little things that we have to react to. And the Travis thing that you're mentioning is one of those. But yeah, in terms of informing all the various subprojects, the things that they need to be aware of, that's one of the things we're going to try to work on. And that's part of why we have these little updates from the security subproject. So Sarah, what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to go back to our GitHub and maybe make an issue out of that kind of dissemination of things to subprojects. What kind of mechanisms can we put in place for that? I think that's a good issue to raise.
Roland, do you know Steph Savage by any chance?
I do not.
Okay, well, or I would suggest that you and Rick, or you, just sometime when you've got some time, head over. Head over to the CSE department there. It gives you a chance to visit the Granite Bear. So Steph and his group. Steph
oh, now I know who you're talking about. Okay.
Yeah, he's a friend, so I can, but he's also a very welcoming and warm guy, so you won't need any intros. Mm-hmm. And he and his colleagues like Jeff Volker would be extremely interested in this project and would be very, and I think might have some suggestions and help for you.
All right, great.
And they're really good, and they're really good, and this is an incredibly important project that you have.
All right, thanks for that as well. All right, I got 2 things to do here.
Love leaving meetings with to-do lists, right?
Yeah. What else was I going to do today? All right. Okay, anything else, or should we move on? All right, great, thanks.
Thank you so much for the continued updates on this. I actually want to circle back. I saw, Loic, you added a quick report after we started. Did you want to circle back to that, or is that okay there?
No, it's just a quick report. I have nothing more to say and no demo prepared, nothing. So it's just to give a heads up, and that's it.
Okay, well, awesome. For people not looking at the notes when we are recording this, Loic has this HDF5 file extension has a new release. Hooray, we love releases. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to put the spotlight on you.
Yes, well, it was worth mentioning that one that was developed by Max, which is JupyterLab HDF5, was needing JupyterLab 3 release. And so I released last week, I think, version 1.0.0 that brings support for JupyterLab 3. So I'm waiting for people to try it out and tell me if there is any problem with it.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you get feedback soon. Okay, then the next person we have is Rick. Are you ready to share?
I am ready to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
If I can. Sorry, navigating the UI always takes a second.
No worries. This truly happens in every meeting. Yeah, you've got it.
Okay, thanks. So, first of all, this is just to let everybody know, this is very early, and I'm really looking principally for feedback. And which my email is there, and you can always give me feedback offline or here offline or on discourse, whatever you like. I'm really, any comments at all are appreciated. So you can see here I've got a dashboard, which is U.S. presidential elections from 1828 to 2000. With here we're looking at 1960. The states are color coded in the usual way, which is red for Republican, blue for Democrat, and white in this case for third party. And if I click on a state like Nevada, for some reason, I can see how Nevada voted in the 1960 election. I also see the popular vote, or the Electoral College vote for 1960, the popular vote. And here I can see the voting history of Nevada, which you can see was red, now then sort of turned blue and is kind of turning reddish again, strangely. Anyhow, and as I go through the years, I see how things have changed over the years. So back in 1892, the South was blue and the North was red. And in 2008, things look very different. So that's a dashboard, and I produced this strictly from a Jupyter notebook. And I'd like to show you a little bit about how that was done. This is an extension which we're going to make available when we make it get it just a little bit more mature. So here's the database that we start, and I'd like to just spend a few minutes doing a couple of minutes building the first couple of charts on that, and you can showing how it's published. So we started off with this database. It comes from the Cook Political Report, and as you can see here, we have presidential elections with the year in the first row, the candidates in the second row, and the values for each state and nationwide in the subsequent rows. And now I'm going to go to a Jupyter notebook right here, and this is simply going to take that data and turn it into a table format, which would have been, had I used pandas in this, would have been a lot shorter, and so stupid of me not to. Anyway, so I'm going to start off, but before I start to execute the notebook, I'm going to fire up a Galileo Dashboard, as it's called. And this is an editor which will let me just construct the dashboard that you saw from the data in the notebook using drag and drop operations. So here's the dashboard text. As you can see, it's rendering in JupyterLab. And now let me go back to the notebook. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what's going on in this notebook, except that it's reading in that CSV file that you saw and turning it into a one-dimensional table where we have columns. As I execute this, we can now see the columns I've got: year, state, name of the candidate, the party of the candidate, the votes he got, and the percentage. So we just have a single table like that, which is sitting in what amounts to a pandas data frame, what we call a Galileo table. And we're sending it. And once we've computed it, I'm going to go back to my dashboard file that you can see I'm editing here. And I currently have no tables. And now the kernel, using the standard mechanism that's familiar from IPI widgets, and certainly was familiar from Angus's demo earlier, it just sends the data off to the dashboard. So now you can see we have the presidential vote table, which we've just computed. And once we have that, I can filter it. So I'm going to add a filter over here. And I'm going to get a slider, which by default is going on year. So I'd like to, I'll just create that and drag it down here and go back to my notebook and create some more tables. I'm just creating a pivot record, a nationwide vote table, and I'm now going to turn the pivot table into a margin table where +10 is a Democratic landslide, +5 is a narrow Democratic victory, -5 is a Republican landslide, -10 is a narrow Republican victory, and 0 is a third party victory. So that computes out from the pivot table, and I send it over to the dashboard. And now, as you can see, if I go back to tables, I've got a bunch of them, all the tables that I've computed and just sent over. And now that I've got a table, I can create what I call a view on it. And a view is just a subset of a table. So in this case, I'm going to take the presidential margins table. I'm going to give it the view margin map, the name margin map, created. And then I'm going to be asked, well, what columns do I want? Well, in this case, I want state and margin from this the table has 3 columns. I only want 2, state and margin. And I'm going to use this thing to filter the rows that I look at. So I only get the views that are I only get the years that are compatible with this filter. So I update it, then I create a chart based on which I'm also going to call margin math, and I'm going to base it on the view. I get all the tables and views here, margin map. So I create that, and now this appears. The chart itself appears in the top left corner, and it always appears as a table because that's universally rendered. It's also not typically what I want, so I get this chart editor popped up. I want a map chart over the United States region. The Democrats are blue, and we'll make third parties white and no value black. Say that's okay, and it changes. And now, indeed, as I move the slider, you can see the map changes with respect to what I get. I'll do one more very quickly, just to illustrate one more aspect of this, and then throw it open for questions. Which is I'll create another view. This is just for state by popular vote. So percentage of the vote by party. I want this on presidential vote, actually. So here are the various things I've got. In this case, I want my x-axis to be party, my y-axis to be percentage of the vote. And you'll notice I have 2 filters here, the year filter, which we see here, but also this map is a filter. And this is how clicking on a state selects a particular state. And any chart has this property that clicking on it selects the appropriate x-axis value, which in this case is states, charts. Create a chart based on this view that I just created. I don't have to use the same name for charts and views. I tend to, because it's easy. It's easier for me to remember what input is to what chart. Create this guy. What the heck, I'll take a bar chart or a column chart, and there we go. And as I click on the state, let's say Texas, I see how Texas voted in 1948. And I could continue, but it's just a repetition of these operations, and you see plenty. One thing I do want to point out is that this thing, it does have a, this thing is a JSON file, which should update and I can also look at it as a JSON file, and you can see this thing pops up this way. So this could also be generated if I wanted as just a straight JSON file. And then the dashboard here, as you can see, takes the name of a JSON file to render right here as the dashboard. So basically, just moving this to any public URL would let me publish instantly. And with that, I'll take questions.
I think you have at least one in the chat, right, Tony?
Oops, yeah, there's someone in the chat. Sorry, did I?
Don't worry, presenting and looking at chat is usually a good idea anyway.
I think this looks super cool. With these tools, there are a few out there, like HoloViews does stuff like this. One of the things that always seems like a toss-up to me is being able to use the UI and then also being able to programmatically work on things. Does this tool have that ability?
So first of all, I should make some, the answer is that's a really good question. And as with many really great questions, the answer is I'm not really sure. We'd have to dig into it deeper, which I'd love to do. The answer is there are several ways. The answer is there are several ways we can cut this. So one is, yeah, you can certainly, you don't even need to use this drag and drop editor. You can just push. You could just push out the data structure. But two, the answer is no, and I'd like some help with that. Or the answer really is that we really could do better, and I'd like some help with it. So let me just. So the reason we built this thing is there's actually 3 chunks of technology here, of which one is just pure Jupyter, and the other 2 are things that we would like to integrate into Jupyter in a very deep way. One of which goes to that extension that you talked about, Tony. So the first is obviously Jupyter itself. The second is that there's a little chunk of code. So the editor here is this guy is a web page sitting within an iframe. And so there's an extension to Jupyter, which is currently a closed repo, but is under the BSD license. I'm going to open it up when I get the bugs out. And the other thing I'd really like to do is genericize this thing so that any web application sitting in an iframe can talk to the Jupyter file system directly, just using the same extension. And all you have, and you don't have to write code. All you have to do is say, here's the iframe, here's the file type, go. And it just, and it happens by, and so anybody can use this for their web-based editor extensions. And then the third is this web-based editor itself, which is and this is, so the web-based editor, the dashboard editors, is an application that, largely I wrote on top of an open source project called Lively Next. And what I would really, and the limitations on this right now in terms of the dashboard application is what I can expose as in a widget-based UI on top of Lively. What I'd love to do is really deepen that so people could put together simulations. So the answer, Tony, is I would love to do it. I just don't know the UI to do. And it's easy to do if I could figure out the UI, or let me change that pronoun, if we could figure out the UI.
Or if there are more hours in the day.
Or if there were more hours in the day. But I mean, this is why I wanted to show this to this group, because I think there's huge potential here for a lot of stuff and other ways the community could use this. So the answer is thank you. And I'm sorry to spend so long answering such a short question.
Also, Angus, I saw you had your hand raised and I missed it. So sorry, go ahead. Was that an intentional hand raise?
Angus, I think you're muted.
Mic switches. Okay, yes, it was an intentional hand raise. I put it on late, so thanks for noticing. Rick, this looks really interesting. And I was wondering, so is what's happening here that the notebook itself is pushing sort of what becomes static content to this front end sort of renderer? So is it everything embedded that needs to be embedded inside this JSON object? For example, the table data and whatever else you've pushed from the notebook?
Yes, it is, Nick. And here's, or Adam, sorry, pardon me. And there are 2 things I'd like to do about that. So the first is, the first, which is just straight plumbing, is to have the widgets on the dashboard ask for data from the notebook and get it back. And that isn't really very hard. That's just making the well, you know this better than I do, how easy that is. But the other issue that I have in doing is that okay, once we do that, what we'd really like to do is let people package up what they've got and throw it into a JSON file, which can be rendered as we've built a renderer, but we can also just statically freeze this and throw it into a zip file that people can pull anywhere. Anyhow, I'd like to be able to do that, but the trouble is that if the data source is sitting externally, then we have to find some way to co-publish the notebook as a data server, and that's a little bit bigger lift. So I'm not but so the answer is yes, we can do it, but it's in 2 stages. Or we can, you're right now it's all self-contained. I'd like to make it not self-contained so we could have very large or dynamic data sources feeding the notebook.
Well, great, thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks for an awesome demo and another lovely discussion. I do want to check, we have one more thing on the agenda that I probably didn't leave enough time for, but thank you so much.
Thank
Theodore,
you.
do you have your...
Yeah, hi. Look, I'm really new to this, to Jupyter Lab development. I've been a user of Jupyter software for the past, like maybe 4 or 5 years. It's a piece of software that really revolutionized the way I do research and programming, and I'm really grateful to the community for doing this. About a month ago, I started looking into developing Jupyter Lab extensions and customizing Jupyter Lab to fit my own needs. And I've went through, the fantastic tutorial from last year's JupyterCon that was done by Alex, Carla, and Carla, and there was like someone else, like fantastic. It was like a 3-hour stream, but the 1.5 hours of the content that is there is really nice. And the Jupyter Lab extension examples repository, I like popping into open source community meetings to see the people, and maybe, if someone can point me to good development tutorials that teach how to utilize the Jupyter Lab front end itself, like for example, there is this plus icon in the file browser, and I want to have this file, like this plus icon, like in the left panel when the file browser is closed, so that I can create a launcher panel without opening the file browser. It's like super easy task, and I want to make it I want to go through this myself, but I really need help to point me to some tutorials and good docs. Any help, please?
That's a great question. People have thoughts. I don't have any personally, sorry.
I mean, it might be. Sorry, who is that?
I don't have any answers. Angus might have better answers, but the Jupyter Lab dev meeting might be a good place to go. That happens every Wednesday. So that might be a place to bring this up. There's a more focused community there.
I was at the dev meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the level of issues being discussed there is like so super important. I think that, like a question of pointing to tutorials just does not belong to it at the meeting of that magnitude. I mean, like that was a serious meeting there.
That's unfortunate.
As a committer on that project, I'd like to argue that that's not the case, and I'm sorry that we gave you that impression. It might have been one of those weeks where a couple of the high tier guys both decided to have a really in-depth discussion. That does happen in that meeting every once in a blue moon, but it is actually not how most of those meetings go. We actually do want new people to come in and ask questions like this in that meeting. I would recommend going into that meeting again tomorrow and trying again. And just putting your name on the agenda like you did here will always give you time. We'll always make sure to have time to discuss those topics.
I have this imposter syndrome that, because the magnitude of this project, the impact this project has in my life is it's impossible to overestimate this.
But Theodore, imagine tens or hundreds or thousands of people like you who have seen the same problem, who have had the same issues you have, but didn't have, and by the way, thank you so much for coming, didn't speak up. Documentation is amazingly important. I mean, saying, this isn't important enough for the Jupyter Lab. Sorry, I've been an open source contributor for 30 years. Let me tell you, there is nothing more important. No programming tool is more important than a pen. It's just vital. And by the way, I'm not good at it. So please come.
And just
thank you. I will. Yeah, Agnes, please.
I think looking for tutorials is always a good one because people go, I'm sure I've seen something somewhere, but haven't written it down. And I would also recommend, I don't also have any good links right now to recommend to you, but I would recommend if you use any of these sort of the asynchronous platforms. So if you use like Gitter or Discourse, I'm not so sure on Discourse. I don't use it for sort of development conversations as much myself, but the Gitter discussion is usually really good. If you have a specific question, you can go on there and ask it.
Yeah, I had one of those, and I had a very good link to a GitHub repo that came to me through Gitter, and it actually it opened up a whole set of opportunities, because it shows you how you need to structure your search query for GitHub to get very good, very good examples. And so this. Yeah, okay, I'll ask probably the same question at the dev meeting tomorrow. And thank you very much for this advice. And thank you all for being a part of this community and doing. It's absolutely fantastic what Jupyter does. Thank you.
Thank you for being part of this community and speaking at the far more public community call. I know you were saying you're worried, but this was wonderful, so thank you. Sorry we didn't have any immediate answers. I will ask around though. Is there any last minute thing? I know we are at time, but final thoughts on that topic or anything else? I need to learn to sing like the Jeopardy theme better for these quiet moments, huh? Okay then. That's it. We did it. Woohoo! That was awesome, everyone. Thank you for so many great discussions. It was awesome to hear what everyone was thinking, and such a great range today too. I'm going to be super excited to rewatch this recording myself. But two things also, you can always give feedback on this call on that Google form if you want. If there's anything you want to say, I also won't know who you are. If you're like, this was terrible, fix things. Or if you're like, this was great. You can also already sign up for next month's call if this was so inspirational. I know I love seeing this energy, so sometimes I get excited. And thank you so much for all your time, everyone. I'm going to stop recording and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.